Good morning. I'm going to talk about Erich Fromm and Global Public Sociology, a book that I've just published with Bristol University Press. And in doing that, I'm going to break up the presentation into three parts. First, I'm going to do a little bit of a context setting and talk about how I came to write this book. Some of you may have read or be familiar with some of the other things I've written about Fromm over the years. So I want to tell the story about how I came to write this particular framing of a book on Fromm as a forgotten public sociologist. Secondly, and this is a book really written to sociologists and trying to contribute to sociology itself, even though I certainly understand that it's not a book that's trying to capture the Erich Fromm. Fromm was a psychoanalyst, was a humanist thinker, was a spiritual theological thinker, political theorist. There are lots of ways into Erich Fromm's work. This is not an attempt to capture the Fromm or the true Fromm, but it is an attempt to take one piece of his approach and lay out what he has to contribute to sociology and what his sociology has to contribute to today as we look around the world and see some terrible events and terrible political, cultural processes and events that are unfortunately bringing Fromm's writings back into new relevance. So there is a Fromm revival happening, and the book is trying to contribute to that from the angle of sociology. And thirdly, the book is also an attempt to use sociology to do an analysis of the general questions of how academics write to the public. So it has some things to say about how writing to the public shaped Fromm's career, how he became a public sociologist, how being a public writer shaped his reception and his reception in different parts of the world, how we could think about the case of Fromm in order to try and develop, and this is part of the book written to sociologists trying to develop a general theory or general research agenda on public academic work. And finally, I'm going to end by offering some potential lessons that the book has to offer to this community that has gathered here today. And thank you for everybody who's made this event possible, Rainer, most of all, but the group in Berlin and all the staff and this broader community from scholars. So I want to say some things about what potential lessons this sociological analysis might offer for those of us who want to build on this Fromm revival and try and shape the world that we live in some scary and dangerous times. So starting with the autobiographical My Path to Fromm in this book section, I was born in Scotland with an Irish background, and like Kieran, and I grew up in Canada. And initially, I was not really intellectually oriented. I was really into soccer or the world's game, football. And I went to the United States on a soccer scholarship, really with the intention of playing professional soccer, which didn't work out for me, which was good enough in the end. But I became an intellectual by reading Escape from Freedom. So Escape from Freedom had a transformative effect on my life. But part of part of that was, if you think about different paths into becoming interested in Fromm, some people take a spiritual theological path, some people take a clinical path, his influence on psychoanalysis. There are other psychological theories can bring you into to Fromm's orbit. But I became interested in Fromm primarily because of the socialist Fromm, not because of the psychoanalytic or the kind of clinical Fromm that Catherine Silver did such a great job last meeting and outlining. It was the socialist Fromm that drew me in to his writings, and you see that in Escape from Freedom and The Saint Society and Marx's Concept of Man. And it was those books that really were my path to the Frommian world. But while I was an activist in the United States, I got connected to someone called Michael Harrington, who was a famous American public intellectual and the most famous socialist intellectual in the United States, well before Bernie Sanders became famous. So they knew each other and were politically engaged with each other. And so I was on the margins of as a young graduate student of the Democratic Socialists of America. And there's a discussion of the Democratic Socialists of America, which came out of the American Socialist Party, or the Socialist Party of America, which Fromm was active in, and Harrington and Fromm engaged with each other and had some similarities and some differences. So that was sort of where I started. But when I went to the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and entered a PhD program in sociology at the time, my worldview was that the last thing I wanted to do is become an academic. I really, there was an incident in my youth where someone had asked me for advice as an academic. Someone I knew from the political movements asked me for advice as an academic. And I had said, quite indignantly, I'm not an academic, I'm an intellectual. Of course, I ended up becoming an academic because I needed a job. And I loved sociology, came to love sociology. But my writing about Fromm was essentially treating Fromm as a sociological concept. So this is way back in the mid 1990s. So at that period of time in the 1990s, American sociologists did not care about Fromm. He truly was in the English-speaking world in any case. So Fromm has a global reception, and it's different in different parts of the world. And some of you may have a different experience. But in the 1990s, Fromm was really on the outs among English language sociologists, especially in the United States, where sociology had become the most professionalized. And so what I had done was try and use Fromm as a case study to try and talk about general issues of our canons, why we read this person, not that person, how schools of thought and theoretical traditions are created sociologically, how interdisciplinary theories are received in disciplinary orthodoxies within the university. These were the issues that I was trying to kind of sell Fromm as someone that we should think about in sociology, without depending on people liking or being moved by Fromm as I was, and as all the rest of us, all of us are here. So I built on an American historian named Russell Jacoby, who turned out to be a salvation for me intellectually, even though I have some very strong disagreements with Russell Jacoby. He actually was partly responsible, as I've written on the Fromm Forum, for ruining Fromm's reputation. But after that, he wrote a book called The Last Intellectuals, 1987, and this created this concept of the public intellectual, the term public intellectual. So that allowed me to frame Fromm's ideas as a case study in public intellectuals, people who write to general audiences, and something that was being undermined by the power of the academy, particularly in the United States. So when I received a job at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and received tenure there, I did so on the basis of publishing in mainstream sociology journals, and I have some of the names of them on the slides. But this was my attempt to kind of frame Fromm as an example of a sociologist who was a public intellectual. Because of the negative reputation that Fromm had in sociology, and I think this is changing. This is what the Fromm revival is about. There's a rethinking of Fromm's reputation, because because at that time it was kind of almost a suicidal project, and I knew people who wrote about Fromm and never received jobs and were really marginalized because of the resistance or hostility or a set of stereotypes and untruths that had been circulated and were circulated about Fromm. So I moved to talk about other issues. So I wrote about Noam Chomsky. I wrote about the general issue of the psychosocial. I wrote quite a bit about Canadian sociology, distinct from American sociology, as I came home to Canada. Right now I'm writing about George Soros and conspiracy theories that are circulating like they did in the period when Escape from Freedom was written. And but I also wrote about public sociology and kind of what it means to write to the public, and that comes out of something that was happening. And I did this to sort of establish my reputation as a sociologist, separate from writing about Fromm. And I did so because Michael Burroway, who was an American sociologist, he's a Brit, actually, an English scholar, but he was trained at the University of Chicago. And in 2004, he was the president of the American Sociological Association. And in 2005, his thinking about these issues, about writing for the public, were published in the American Sociological Review, the premier sociology journal in American sociology. And in this, he made an argument that there were 4 types of sociology, and he called them professional sociology, which is sociology that is written for peer-reviewed journals that deals with theory and methods and substance within the core of the university situated professional sociological world. And this is the core of what sociologists do. And you have professional philosophy, professional political science, all disciplines have this core inside the university. And so for Burroway, that was one form of sociology, and the book tries to show the extent to which Fromm did do professional sociology, and he did. He published in the core in the American Sociological Review. He did empirical research. That's why the Frankfurt School were brought to Columbia, because of the workers in Weimar study. So the book tries to show that Fromm was a professional sociologist. But a second type of sociology is policy sociology. So this is when sociologists work with a client or a government, a business, a community organization to solve a problem outside of the university. And Fromm did some policy work in the Social Character in the Mexican Village book. Is really a kind of an example, important example of policy sociology. But he also did other kind of policy oriented work, especially around foreign policy and disarmament policy. Critical sociology is a third type of sociology that Burroway argues. And this is when it's inside the university, not with outside clients, but inside the university, where sociologists criticize professional sociology or they criticize policy sociology based on some normative set of criteria. So critical sociologists might say that sociologists don't deal enough with race, or they don't deal with gender adequately, or that the policy sociologists who work with the criminal justice system, or the policy sociologists that do foreign policy work with governments are too subservient to outside demands, and they've compromised their normative values. So critical sociologists offer a normative critique of the profession. And Fromm certainly did this in lots of different ways, where he critiqued the behaviorist assumptions of sociology that had come to be important. He critiqued positivist sociology. He also did this with psychology. So I lay out in the book how Fromm can be understood as a critical sociologist. But the most important argument that Burway was making, and the argument that I engage most centrally in the book, is the argument for taking sociology out into the public and dialoguing with publics. And there's lots of sociologists in this public sociology debate that happened after 2004, 2005. It's spread around the world, and disciplines, sociological associations, journals around the world have been arguing for the last 15, 17 years or so about what a public sociology would look like. And any attempt to reform a discipline brings out and highlights a set of heroes or a set of role models for public sociology, or a canon of public sociology. And some of the most important people in that canon are David Riesman, the first sociologist who was on the cover of Time magazine, was at Harvard, and was mentored by Erich Fromm. He's often talked about as the most important public sociology of this early period. C. Wright Mills, a radical version of public sociology that had an enormous influence on the 1960s, and taught at Columbia University and wrote what he called about the sociological imagination. W.E.B. Du Bois, an African American who was expelled from the discipline because of his political activism and because of his race, who has a global presence as a public sociologist and has been brought back into the field, and was a very major civil rights activist and Black liberation struggle activist. And also Harriet Martineau in the late 19th century, early 20th century, Jane Addams. They were feminist and women sociologists who were on the margins of the field and have been brought back in to help us think about how public sociology can speak to the public and expand who gets to be defined as part of the public, and gets to talk about women as part of that public. So these are the major people who are talked about as public sociologists. And the book basically tries to make the case that Fromm should be understood first as a sociologist, but also as someone, as a professional sociologist and a policy sociologist, but also someone who belongs in this public sociology canon, who has written more books that sold way more copies than any of these other public sociologists, that reached a larger public than any of these other public sociologists, that engaged policy to a significant extent, offered a critique of sociology and some of the limitations of sociology, and that he was a global figure in some of these other sociologists, particularly David Riesman, as important as he is, was very much of an American figure. And even C. Wright Mills, who has a global presence, was far less global than Fromm. So Fromm was a public sociologist, but a global public sociologist, and he belongs in this canon. And the book is an attempt to put him back into that history, but it's also an attempt to take Fromm's ideas, lay out the sociological content of those ideas, and connect them to the crisis of democracy and far right and left-wing authoritarianism that we're seeing around the world, and the crisis of modernity, the crisis of emotions, the crisis of an increasingly insane society, and to link Fromm's ideas and reformulate ideas to the current moment, as well as asking the questions about when we look at the case of Fromm, what can we learn about the general question of public sociology from the case of Fromm? What can we learn about Fromm himself and his career? Is there Fromm thinking about him in this way and focusing in a separate type of analysis on his writing to the public? And thirdly, what can we learn as Frommians, or people inspired by or influenced by Fromm, who want to do some of the kind of work that writing to the public involves in a new context? What can we learn with social media? What can we learn? And in the context of a revival of interest in Fromm, what can we learn from Fromm's case? So that's basically the book. I'm going to go to the second part of the presentation to talk and to really highlight the content of Fromm's sociology. And this part of the book can be broken up into 4 different sections. So chapter 1 is an analysis of escape from freedom. The second part of Fromm's sociology is chapter 3, where I really focus in on Fromm's analysis, conformity, and alienation in the 1950s, his public sociology linked to David Riesman and to the early New Left and his analysis of alienation in the same society. The third section of Fromm's sociology looks at Fromm's analysis of love in chapter 4, which mostly is dealing with how Fromm became a forgotten public sociologist, but includes a discussion of the content of Fromm's analysis of love, and both how that is a template for a certain kind of public sociology today, as well as offering some ideas for thinking about intimacy and love in the current moment. And the fourth section of Fromm's sociology is in chapter 6, where I look at the last major scholarly works that Fromm published and the ways in which we can think about social character as a concept in Social Character in a Mexican Village, also an attempt to do policy sociology to help the Mexican government and Mexican communities, written with Michael Maccabee, into dealing with a new type of development and avoiding some of the pathologies of capitalist market development, and as well as the anatomy of human destructiveness. Not so much sociology, but more public social psychology or public psychoanalysis, but engaging with a number of sociological issues and offering something about how to think about destructiveness and violence that can help sociologists. It can help us think about the current world. Now, I first became convinced that there was, in fact, there's always a danger of wishful thinking in these matters because we're writing about Fromm and influenced by Fromm. But I was first convinced that there was, in fact, a Fromm revival happening after reading an opinion piece by Michelle Goldberg in the New York Times in 2017 in the wake of Trump. And she argued very passionately and strongly that escape from freedom was relevant to understanding this new global Trumpism. And I think this was the origins of this new revival, but in a more theoretically impressive way, I think. Masha Geshen, a Russian thinker, New Yorker magazine writer, has a book called The Future is History, where they make the case that Nazism and Putinism, they wrote a very important book on Putin called The Man Without a Face, and global Trumpism, all of these political phenomena could be understood through the prism of Escape from Freedom and the work of Erich Fromm. And Gesson really elevates Fromm, as he should be, along with Hannah Arendt, into the status of a major theoretical thinker. And Gesson argues that these movements can be, from the 30s and from today, can be understood through the categories of unprincipled opportunism that make the movements connected to and powerful for mass publics who are experiencing a sense of personal insignificance, a masochistic and sadistic yearnings that are rooted in impoverished economic, cultural, and emotional lives. And they draw very explicitly on escape from freedom, and the revival is happening. So the chapter tells the story of escape with a focus on how it made him famous and drew him out of the Frankfurt School networks. He'd already left the critical theory networks, but it really was a major break that put him on a path to developing a broader research agenda that he increasingly had the resources and the autonomy to do after Escape from Freedom. And it tries to show how Fromm's Escape from Freedom analysis is with a focus on humiliation, shame, rage, and authoritarianism rooted in an analysis of emotions is useful for today. Now, all of you know Escape from Freedom. I won't rehash the basic arguments, but in the chapter 1, I make the case that while we build on Escape from Freedom, we need to reformulate some of his insights in dialogue with current sociological research. So I make the case that we have to improve on Fromm's class analysis, where he tends to focus on the lower middle class. We can think of these right-wing or authoritarian movements being influential among workers or the lower middle class, professional managerial class, capitalist elites. Fromm was aware of these other class bases for authoritarianism, but I think in the end, he put too much focus on the lower middle class. And I would argue that Frommian analysis has to consult and engage with. It's an empirical question to what extent these movements are shaped and influencing the lower middle class. Sometimes they do, sometimes it is more elites who are motivated by these kind of psychological dynamics of escaping from freedom. I would also argue that Frommian analysis needs to take more seriously discourses about race, in critical race theory, the ideas of anti-Semitism, ideas about Eurocentrism, and various ideas about masculinity or toxic masculinity of various sorts. So these ideas are we shouldn't accept sociological theorizing on these issues uncritically, and that we definitely want to insert the psychosocial elements into these discussions. But I would argue that a Frommian analysis for today has to do more in this direction. I also think that Fromm's analysis, well, it does a very good job of talking about macro structures and social psychological dynamics. It could focus more on states and social movements as autonomous places and bureaucracies and organizations as autonomous dynamics that we need to understand. And it needs a broader comparative historical sociology. Just looking at Germany as Escape from Freedom, or mostly does, has to be expanded on in a broader historical and comparative sociology. So that's my analysis of Escape from Freedom in chapter 1. In chapter 3, I talk about Fromm in the Cold War and his influence on what Burraway calls traditional public sociology. This is sociologists who write to the public through the New York Times or popular best-selling books, and radical Marxist sociology and a kind of organic public sociology. So the interesting thing about Fromm is he influenced Riesman, the most important traditional elite public sociologist of the 50s, and he influenced the 60s movements and the radicals from the New Left, this organic, politically engaged type of sociology. So Fromm did both of those things. And the book essentially starts with Riesman and looks at his public sociology revisited and talks about how Fromm mentored Riesman, but how Riesman taught Fromm things as well, and how The Lonely Crowd, the best-selling sociology book of all time, was inspired by Fromm's analysis of the marketing orientation. And I'm really interested in how the example of Fromm and Riesman working together was a really interesting case of how there was a kind of civility that Riesman promoted, working with conservatives, working with the establishment, and a subversion that Fromm was drawn to, a kind of more radical critique of society. That Riesman and Fromm disagreed with each other on that, but they talked to each other, they worked with each other. Fromm initially mentored Riesman, and then they became friends, and Lonely Crowd comes out of this. It's sort of basically the most important public sociology of the period, and sociologists don't know how important Fromm was to that. But Riesman also offered things to Fromm and to Frommians. So Riesman was much more ethnographic than Fromm. Riesman thought that Fromm overgeneralized and sometimes didn't understand America from inside. So he was looking at America. It's understandable. He was an immigrant in exile from the Nazis in America. And so he looked at America to some extent as an outsider, and Riesman had a more of an insider viewpoint. So those two things, I think, insider, outsider, and civility and subversion, they connected with each other, Riesman and Fromm did, and produced a very powerful model for public sociology, at least as I argue in this chapter and the first part of chapter 3. And this analysis is very relevant for today as we think about a new character, marking character, various forms of new types of characters that Rayner and others have articulated, and where parental authority is being undermined, the university authority is being undermined, and Fromm offers a new way of thinking about this that's very relevant for today, and we often see what David Riesman talked about as a false personification, how because of social media, we identify with heroes and celebrities as if we know that if we project a lot of things onto social media. And Frommian public sociology can help us think about some of those questions. The Sane Society, in the second section of chapter 3, talks about how Fromm influenced C. Wright Mills and the New Left and helped create a Marxist sociology in the 1960s. And the book talks about how marketing society is a bit more radical version of public sociology than David Riesman offered. And he talks very explicitly about how capitalism creates anxieties, insecurities, creates a suicide, creates drug addiction, creates alienation, not as a accidental aspect of society, but as part of its normal functioning, the pathology of normality that, one could think about it as well in the way that someone who opposed Fromm, but a very important conservative sociologist of this period named Robert Nisbet talked about the loose individual. Our modern society, modernity creates loose individuals that are susceptible to right-wing movements, susceptible to personal sense of insignificance and personal psychological pathology. So I think the Sane Society, especially in the social media world, has enormous amount to say. And I try and make the case for all the power of Fromm's analysis in the Sane Society. He could have stayed in more contact with contemporary research on some of these issues, drug addiction, alienation, and certainly today, when we can address these issues, we need to take Fromm's analysis as a starting point, not as the final word on these issues. Now, the third point that I make about Fromm's public sociology in the 1950s and 60s is in chapter 4, where I talk about the art of loving. And it's partly the story is Fromm's writing to the public in a best-selling book about love. It's part of the reason why he lost status as a public sociologist, I would say unfairly so. But it also, this book, The Art of Loving, was a template for popular sociological self-help books, selling something like 26 million copies around the world and in different languages. And later on in the 1960s and 70s and today, there's a whole range of often feminist sociologists. So Fromm has, I think, some important things to say about the world and love and families that has an influence and has things to offer feminist sociologists. But as Lynn Chancellor has helped us see, some of Fromm's language gets in the way, and some of his categories get in the way of a full appreciation by feminist publics, by mass publics, and some feminist are built on some of the kinds of things that he did. And I'm thinking here about a sociologist, American sociologist named Lillian Rubin, someone else called Pepper Schwartz, and an African-American literary writer and popular writer named Bell Hooks, who wrote from a Black feminist perspective. So these thinkers, and was very influenced, by the way, by Erich Fromm. So these, and The Art of Loving in particular. So these books are attempts to take the art of loving and take it to the public. And the Jordan Peterson, I think, from a very different theoretical and political perspective, is also 12 Rules for Life, or the new Beyond Order, new 12 Rules for Life, are an attempt to sort of do the art of loving from a politically conservative viewpoint. So the art of loving lives on today, not always in ways that we appreciate or that I personally have political sympathy for. So the book, though, speaks to today, but it needs to be reformulated. So chapter 4 offers some criticisms about the gender language, as Vincenzo's written about the need to put gay and lesbian rights more at the center of the analysis, perhaps the art of loving overreacting to dogmatic libido theory or simplistic focus on sexuality like Wilhelm Reich, perhaps overreaches or sort of misses the mark and doesn't put enough focus on the autonomy of sexuality, which I think current research in the sociology of sexuality can help us with. And perhaps he had by that time stopped engaging with the sociological research agenda. And I think more of us could take the art of loving and take it right into the center of sociology with this core insight that love is a decision and an art, and that the pathologies of the market can damage our ability to find love, and that this sex category is something we shouldn't throw out with simplistic theories of gender identity while maintaining a commitment to trans rights, I would argue. But some of Fromm's ideas about sex should also not be thrown out, but probably most importantly, making the case in public as a public psychoanalyst. And there's some very important work written on that. But the psychoanalysts have something to say, so that sociologists should engage with this work. The fourth part of my analysis of Fromm's sociology deals with his major scholarly works published in the 70s. So Social Character, Mexican Village with Michael Maccabee, which I've written a little bit about in the Fromm Forum, and then another chapter with Michael Maccabee himself in Karen Durkin's edited book. So along with Joan Braun, has important things to say about the prophetic vision about Fromm and Fromm's use in fighting the far right. So chapter 6, I start with Social Character in American Village and try and link it to contemporary sociological analysis and community studies. And The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness is less public sociology, more public psychology, where I make the case that this scholarly work has a lot of strength to help us think about the current pathologies of politics, and we should return to anatomy of human destructiveness. So what I say about the Social Character in Mexican Village is make the case it's a neglected study in sociology, and the concept of social character is something that sociologists should return to. And the book has real findings about the influence of character as an autonomous dynamic that we need to think about, that it's not simply an over-socialized analysis that underestimates emotional dynamics that are rooted in the past and in the theory that Fromm has left us. One could argue that Fromm, perhaps at that point in his career, hadn't spent enough time on this book. Many different projects that he was working on, and getting close to retiring, doing political work in the 60s. So one could argue that more could have been done with the ethnographic element of the study. One could argue that today is going to be much more difficult than in social character kind of Mexican Village, with dealing with communities from outside, indigenous communities. Not a major theme in the book, but work today should focus more on these issues. Issues of gender and race could deal with these questions in a more rigorous way. Sonia and Salvador Milan and the network in Mexico have done a better job of writing about these issues in a participatory action context from inside Mexico. So Fromm was a bit of an outsider, and that's a fair criticism, even though he laid out the framework that we should build on. So the book tries to deal with some of those challenges, but argue that we still need to return to these kinds of studies. So they're very challenging, an enormous amount of resources to do work of this nature. The Anatomy of Human Instructiveness, I try and make the case that is a book of an enormous theoretical ambition. It's not an empirical study, and the social character Mexican Village study had a policy element to it. So Anatomy is a theoretical work. It's a piece of professional social psychology or psychoanalytic work. Has an enormous amount to say about the role of narcissism in politics, as Reiner has helped us understand in his presentation about narcissism. It's building on Fromm's clinical work, as Catherine Silver has emphasized. And I argue here that the work of Bourdieu that talks about habitus can be improved on. And the case studies in the book where he talks about Himmler and Hitler and Stalin are, I think, really profoundly important case studies where Fromm shows how sociologists can have a better understanding of the pathologies of political narcissism through using psychoanalytic theory. Fromm argues for the value of the neurosciences in a way that it's helpful for sociologists, and evolutionary psychology in a non-reactionary way. That in the ways that Peterson sometimes argues, and it avoids the kind of liberal complacency that you see in Steven Pinker. Perhaps the book is a bit long by this time. Fromm may have had done better if he had a network of editors, and he'd been connected more in New York world or the world of other sociologists. So I argue that there was a disadvantage to some of his marginality. So for now, then, just to end on the third point that I want to talk about, lessons for speaking to the public, I want to end on some lessons for Fromm, lessons for sociology, and then lessons for us. So lessons for Fromm, chapter 2 deals with how Fromm became a public sociologist. And then I start with chapter 1 and Escape from Freedom, and then I go back before Escape from Freedom. And so chapter 2 is about how Escape from Freedom came to be written. The second point is I try to make the case for how some of Fromm's sociological insights were limited by his writing to the public and his celebrity stature. And then I end on the insights that he got going against the grain. I'm arguing here, many sociologists argue that if you write to the public, your ideas will be less scholarly. And there's sometimes some truth to that, and I try and acknowledge and concede where that's true. But I end on trying to argue that Fromm gained insights from writing to the public. So optimal marginality for Fromm, I'm building on the work of Jerry Watts, an African-American political theorist who talks about marginality facilitators. So marginality facilitators are institutions and networks and journals and social circles, meetings that people run in their living rooms, from study groups. These are kind of examples of marginality facilitators where you have a set of ideas or a group of people that are left out. And Jerry Watts was talking about Black intellectuals in the 50s. So I try and argue that Fromm became a public sociologist because he had a unique combination of centrality. So he studied with Alfred Weber, a very major sociologist. And later on, he wrote for major New York commercial presses. So Fromm was not marginal to the intellectual world by this time, especially after Escape from Freedom. But he emerged out of marginal networks. So he created some of his insights out of networks of Jewish prophetic thinkers, out of Freudian networks on the margins of the mainstream psychological world and medical world, the Frankfurt School on the mainstream of German academic world, and the Cultural Personality School in the United States, led by Margaret Mead and a set of anthropologists. So Fromm was connected to all of these networks and on the margins, and the networks of the mainstream with Alfred Weber, mainstream sociology, and mainstream commercial press books. And so his marginality was overcome by combining these different networks. Now, I do argue that there was damage done to some of Fromm's activism and his scholarship by the strategy that he took. And that's one of the messages I leave for thinking about Fromm and for all of us, that there's always trade-offs. So some of his political activism, and I talk about it in chapter 5, and it's about Fromm's activism in the 1960s. His activism was shaped by his fame and the money that he brought to movements and political campaigns. And that meant that he was a kind of a celebrity activist and a celebrity intellectual, not only a political activist in the trenches. And that had some distorting influences on his political activism. It helped, he was able to help the movements, but it had a certain kind of distorting influence, which I try and lay out. The fact that he was so famous allowed him to avoid peer review. And that allowed him to say things that the peer review scholars were not interested in or able to see. And I think that has some value, but it also had its costs. He could have done, I think, a better job of consulting contemporary research. And the fact that he was celebrity and famous and in Mexico and in Switzerland meant that he wasn't connected on a day-to-day level with the movements of the 1950s and the feminist movements and the Black liberation struggles in the 1960s and the labor movements that were shaped the Socialist Party. So I would argue that his isolation from these movements freed him to some extent, but allowed him to miss out on some insights. That's another way of making the point that Lynn Chancellor makes about his is missing some of the insights of feminism, even though he brought a critique of patriarchy. That's something we shouldn't forget. But this being outside of the mainstream also brought insights. So there's no question that the dissent network that he was involved in, the American Socialist Party, were blind to some of the insights that Fromm brought in, particularly around environmental issues. And I would say that the Fromm revival started with To Have Her To Be. It started during Fromm's lifetime. And Paul Rosen has a terrific review of To Have Her To Be in The Nation, which got me started about thinking about Fromm. And then I found Rayner's work and started off thinking about those issues in that way. But also I would say that, so if it wasn't for his isolation from the socialist movements, he may not have emphasized the environmental issues that he did. And that's an example of marginality allowing for more insights. And certainly he was ahead of his time in thinking about ecology and the environment in this era where we must deal with climate change. I would also say that there were many academic Marxists who were blind or naive about Stalinism and the authoritarianism in the Soviet Union or East Germany and then Maoist China. And so Fromm, because he was not just an academic Marxist, he was also someone engaged in human rights struggles, someone engaged in peace activism, someone engaged in the actual concrete Socialist Party, which I talk about in chapter 5. But this allowed him to see real-world consequences of Stalinism and dogmatic Marxism and authoritarianism of the left. So this brought real insights, and it led to a certain kind of Marxist humanism outside of the academy, and you see some of that in Jones' work and in Kieran Durkin's important work on humanistic Marxism. So the agenda that I'm offering here in the book for sociology is arguing that we shouldn't assume that public sociology is a good thing or a bad thing. We need to see how it affects particular people and study it. I think we have to ask the question, how do we create and sustain public intellectuals in sociology without the kind of marketing character and careerism that you see in academic celebrity culture? How do we think about this differently? Fromm was a public sociologist in this period after the invention of the paperback book and the creation of the internet. Is in between that. We're now living in a different period where social media is the key driver of public sociology. What does that mean? And I also argue that the case of David Riesman offers an agenda for thinking about studying where conservative and liberal and academic and liberal and radical academics can collaborate and listen to each other, something that seems to me kind of broken down. And the Riesman case, who had connections to conservative intellectuals, and he himself was a liberal intellectual, but Fromm was a radical intellectual. There was a lot more collaboration in that pair of intellectuals, and we should study this more generally outside the case of Fromm and Riesman. So I make the case for that as for sociologists. But now, just to end on lessons for you and us in this Fromm world. There are lots of different lessons that we can talk about that. We have to think about disciplinary differences, national context, and life goals and personal skills. But it's really going to be your choices about how we can build on this that is going to be make or break for this Fromm revival. So I've written the case for public sociology. It's going to be very different in psychoanalysis, psychology, political theory, history, philosophy, education, religious studies, gender studies. I hope we see more books about Fromm's public work in these disciplines, or its potential for public work in these disciplines. And I hope you take Fromm's scholarship into the mainstream of these fields, maybe on the margins of these fields. It's precisely Fromm's challenge to mainstream academic work that means we shouldn't be ashamed of that. It's Fromm's challenge to the mainstream that puts him on the margins. But we need to go inside the mainstream and write about this. You might want to think about whether you want to, which discipline you're interested in, and whether you want to write to the public. It's not an automatic thing. Not all Frommian scholars have to write to the public like Fromm did. He was a very unique person. But writing to the public, especially in social media, has its costs. And those costs are raised by the dominance of the American Academy. As the American Academy, it's highly professionalized, careerist, market orientation that dominates world academic work. So we have to think about what it looks like in your own national context. And I'd love to hear more about that, about what kind of engagements are possible in your own country. And it's harder to do that, I think, in certain contexts and in others. So this is a question to be discussed and talk about the space for and the trade-offs for public sociological work or public academic work in a Frommian vein in Latin America and the Nordic nations, in Central Eastern Europe and Asia, Africa, the EU, the UK, and what it looks like in social media. So I'm not an academic, and I ended up being one. I didn't want to really be a clinician. I don't have activist skills, but some of you have these kinds of skills. So what are your skills? And what does it mean to be public in your own discipline, given your own particular skills? So I'm very excited about being here. Thank you for everybody who put the event on. And I'm looking forward to building this Fromm revival with you and to build sane societies around the world, in a world that desperately needs a Frommian perspective. So thank you for for sharing this time with me.